Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live. I'm Philip Heidson. I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement, and I'm joined by my partner here at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. So thank you for joining me, as always, Kelly, in our AOP Live webinars.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to having a good conversation today.
Yeah, today's conversation. Well, let's before I go into today's conversation, let's just give a little bit of logistics about an AOP Live. If you haven't been to an AOP Live before, there's really no slides. It's all about questions. And that means that there's lots of opportunities for you to pose questions to our panelists. So feel free, you can pop questions in the chat. You'll see those on the right-hand side of your screen. We're always monitoring the chat. There's also a Q&A functionality within our tool. You're more than welcome to pop things in the Q&A too. We get notifications when things are in there, but definitely if you pop stuff in the chat, we will see it and we'll refer to it and ask the questions if we're able to as we go through the conversation. Now, today's conversation, we've titled this Tomorrow's Procurement, a Marked Evolution from the Past. We talk a lot about the future of procurement all the time, really, at Art of Procurement, but we're kind of at this moment in time, a crossroads, perhaps, where there really is an opportunity for procurement to really reflect on how we've got to where we've got to today, but then take advantage of lots of different things that are available to us that weren't available to us in the past to really drive a new future, which is very exciting for us all in the procurement space. Now, we're going to be joined today by two guests. We're joined by Sean Rhoades. Sean is Managing Director of Sourcing and Procurement at Deloitte, and Jason Moore, who's Head of Enterprise Transformation Office at Zip. So without further ado, Sean, Jason, we'll bring you up on stage. Here we go. Welcome to Jason. I don't know if you need to turn your camera on and turn it off and turn it back on again. There we go.
There you go.
Perfect. Welcome to today's AOP Live, Sean, Jason.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Excited. Thank you.
Now, we always kick off with a similar question, just to really give a little bit more context to your backgrounds. And so, Jason, I'm going to ask this to you first, and it's the kind of famous AOP question, which is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is actually both for me. So I started my career in human resources, actually, with a manufacturing company called USG. I did a 6-month technology project for them in Chicago, implementing Oracle HR and Kronos timekeeping systems. And then I went back to Baltimore where I was living, and I really wanted to move to Chicago. So I found a role in procurement as a procurement analyst that got me to Chicago. And so I was in procurement for a few years. Then I got out of procurement for a while. I was in commercial contracting, a company called Axiom. Yeah. And then I joined Discover, and procurement found me there. So, I got tapped to fix what was widely considered a broken procurement process internally. So it was my role to fix it. So, yeah, a little bit of both. I've been in and out of procurement now for a couple of years.
Do you find that the experiences out of procurement helped you when you're back in procurement?
Yeah, I think so. It's funny. I've kind of been around this process in one way or another for almost my entire career. So, if you look at a procurement process, contracting is typically the long pole in the tent. Yeah. And so I got deeply ingrained in the challenges around contracting and contract data. So I got an interesting perspective in that role. What was funny to me was, I was out of procurement probably for, I would say, about 8 years. When I got back into procurement, what I found is not a lot had changed, particularly from a systems and operations perspective. So that was one thing that's been interesting. Now, over the last 5 years, I think it's changed dramatically. I'm sure we'll get into that. But yeah, that was an interesting observation for me.
And Sean, same question to you. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Yeah, I think procurement found me. Worked in a warehouse for the summers to pay for college. So that was kind of my experience when I joined the consulting world. And they were like, perfect, you're a supply chain guy. And put me in there as an analyst. So I was a procurement analyst like you, Jason. And so luckily now I love it. And that's my focus for the past 17 or 18 years has solely been on sourcing and procurement world. But yeah, I think it kind of found me just as I said, I had a lot of supply chain experience working at a warehouse.
No, it's funny. That's where I started, actually, in a warehouse at a General Motors plant doing an internship. Not really I was supposed to be counting widgets in boxes, and I think I was doing more eating at the manufacturing plant cafeteria. But that was my entry point into procurement.
I was probably pretty close to that. I lost my forklift license a few times for not being the best driver as an intern. So you get to count the boxes a lot when you can't drive a forklift.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
We want to start the conversation by talking about the perception of procurement. And Jason, I think it's something, it was interesting when you talked about the gap that you had coming out of procurement, going back into procurement. What are some of the stereotypical perceptions that you kind of see even today that kind of serve as roadblocks on procurement's ability to play a larger role, a more impactful role in the organizations that they serve?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the typical perceptions of procurement is that procurement's too slow. They're a bit of a blocker. They're only focused on cost savings. They're very inflexible. I'm going to engage in procurement. I'm going to engage procurement, and I'm going to get locked into RFP process. It's going to take months and months and months. It's going to wear me down. I just want to move quickly, and I want to move forward with the supplier that I've already selected. So that in my experience, those have typically been the maybe complaints that I've heard over the years.
Now, have you seen those complaints impact your ability as procurement to actually support the organization in the way that you can?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is there's kind of a lack of adoption of procurement and an unwillingness to engage procurement, particularly early. I think if you've been in procurement long enough, you understand the importance of early engagement and driving better sourcing outcomes. And if there is that perception that you're just going to be a blocker or you're just going to kind of stand in the way, there's a lack of adoption of really leaning into that and reaching out to procurement early.
Now, Kelly, you've spent a lot of time, I think, as a practitioner, and you've spent a lot of time as a consultant. Did you encounter some of these perceptions, or, in what regards, if you did you feel like they were real perceptions or perhaps imagined perceptions?
It's actually interesting. So for this, I go all the way back to my practitioner days. And the organization that I worked for actually had a very slick, I'm sure, consultant created deck that we were supposed to use at every sourcing project kickoff meeting. And it was we had a 6-step process, nice flow, nice roles and responsibilities. And what I learned after the first couple of projects is before I even opened that deck, I needed to sort of look around the room and say, I'm not here to tell you no. Right? Because I think a lot of times procurement goes into a situation already thinking 4 steps down the road, bringing in new suppliers, helping figure out new solutions. How are we going to create alternate forms of value? The business comes to the situation already thinking about, she's going to tell me I can't have the supplier I want. Yeah. And so all of the things, the best laid plans that we try to go into these meetings or projects with, it's almost like you need to step back and level set first and say, hey, listen, blue skies for everybody, right? Clean page, fresh start. Let's come to this, think big. I definitely found that if I sort of went through the, prescribed process we were supposed to follow, it didn't create a natural opportunity to address a lot of those preconceptions, which in some cases came from companies other than the one I was working in, but it's sort of figuring out that cultural lay of the land, the individual expectations of the person or the business team that you're working with, and as soon as humanly possible, getting all of that on the table so that it can be addressed directly versus trying to clean up the mess from it later.
Yeah. I think that's important to think about the mindset as well as you're entering into conversations with stakeholders around the fact that at the end of the day, they are the budget holder. Yep. And yes, we can come to the table and we can help influence on sourcing decisions, recommendations, for example, but we're not in control of their budget. And sometimes, you see, and I've seen it around me, I probably did it at the start of my career, where you enter and think, well, I'm going to tell the business who they should be using because I'm procurement. And that's where you start getting yourself into trouble, I think. Sean, you work with organizations of all kinds of different kind of levels of maturity all the time. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about if there's such a thing as a typical perception of procurement that you see across all the different organizations that you work with.
Yeah, building off of what Kelly and Jason said, I think traditionally we do see them as the cost cutting, the more operational function. I am seeing it evolve though. I do see the growing recognition of the strategic importance of risk management, trying to get more innovative, and the focus on compliance. I think that value we're starting to see procurement really lean in heavier on, and be a part of the overall business strategy, as that can be hopefully make them more effective and contribute to the success of the business. So you could start to talk to what Kelly's talking about is, hey, we're not just here to say no and say, here's the lowest cost provider, which I think a lot of people do have that perception, especially just if you walk in and say, hey, we've got somebody and my goal is to just cost cut and I'm trying to get as much savings as possible. I think they kind of shut down a little bit, where if you start to talk about value, if you start to, and a 6-step process is great, right, Kelly? Like, it does help in a lot of ways, but it's, hey,
And
here's
it looks
giving us
nice
time.
on a slide.
It looks great on a slide. I'm a consultant. I love slides, but it's where that process also should help you identify and research and find the right supplier and work with them to partner with.
Do you find that the change in perception is driven, because you talked about you seeing some changes in perception?
Yeah.
Is that driven from top down? So there's somebody within the leadership team of an organization who recognizes that procurement has a greater role to play, or perhaps have experienced that with other organizations, or is actions that are taken that are in the control of procurement in demonstrating that actually we can be relied on, trusted, and partnered with to do different things other than that perception of, well, procurement's just a cost cutter?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's both. I think senior leaders having those relationships that go across the business and be a part of those conversations and align the metrics. I think in the Harvard Business Review document that Jason and team put together, there's some really good discussions there about aligning metrics and making sure that, are we trying to sign up for being more compliant while they're trying to save up for cutting cost or value? So I think it's aligning at the senior leadership level, but it's also going through the experience and having them go through it and feel, hey, this was valuable to me, and see the value and be able to then take that and tell a story to the broader organization of, here's how it worked, here's how it went, it's going to be okay, and we're actually here to help you and partner. I feel like once you get through that first time, a lot of folks do start to see that, hey, that wasn't so painful, that didn't take 12 weeks to go through.
And I just want to shout out, you mentioned a white paper. There was a paper which is Procurement at the Crossroads, which was published by Harvard Business Review. You can actually download that in the chat. There's a link in the top of the chat that's actually pinned. So please feel free to do that as we're going through the conversation, or at the end of the conversation. Now, one of the things, as you referred to, Sean, that's in that report is talking about metric misalignment. And I'm interested, both Sean and Jason, in your perspective on that. When it comes to, and perhaps I'll start with Sean, and then Jason, if you want to jump in. Metric misalignment isn't necessarily just procurement has a different metric than the business, and we're focused on savings and the business isn't. But there's actually different areas of the organization may have different metrics that all come together and misalign with each other, because a CFO may actually be pushing the cost savings, or a supply reduction that's not in line with what a stakeholder may want, and we're kind of the brunt of that because we're enforcing it. And I just wonder if there's any kind of advice or tips, from your experience, of how you kind of balance where metrics or our objectives might be competing, and how we as procurement can kind of smooth that over.
I'll go first, Jason, just briefly on this one. I think one is communicating your value and your metrics that you're trying to achieve. I think that gets underplayed a lot, where just the business doesn't know what you're really trying to sign up for and how you're trying to get there. So I think publishing and communicating your strategy for the year tied to metrics and having that end state be very clear to your business and stakeholders, I think gets missed a lot. I think the second thing is having those discussions with the other leaders of, are we ultimately all headed towards the same vision, right? So if we all roll up to the CFO or the CEO or head of supply chain, we should all be at the table discussing how our goals ultimately align to the bigger vision. I think that's where you have those conversations of, hold on, we're trying to save money. Are we trying to make it more, are we more interested in ESG? Are we more interested in, trying to make sure that we're getting focused spend here? All those things matter when everybody's at the table. I don't know, Jason, if you see that kind of same thing.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a great answer, Sean. I think the biggest thing is just tying those metrics to the broader company objectives so that there's a clear delineation or line of sight to the activities that procurement's doing and how they're supporting the company more generally. I think that's important so that people understand, where procurement is coming from and the activities that they're doing in support of those. I think that's probably the biggest key there.
Mm. And one follow-up, Sean, when it comes to the perception of procurement and typical perception of procurement, you see organizations that have a really positive perception. How do you maintain that? Are there any specific actions when you already feel you're there, but not necessarily resting on your laurels? You've got to continue to kind of invest in that relationship with your organization, essentially, to maintain that position.
I think there's a focus on being proactive and reactive. So I see it as kind of two aspects of it. I think from a proactive standpoint, there's having data at your fingertips so you can plan the right events and do sourcing the right way, go to the business with value opportunities and try to stay ahead of them for the next opportunity. There's also the focus on supply chain resilience and being able to build relationships internally and externally. To me, those are more proactive of what some of the more positive companies are doing. And then there's the reactive part to me of focusing on efficiency and speed. How do we do less with more? Recently is a big conversation and guiding them through the process. I think in some cases there's, a focus on doing a white glove approach of really hand-holding them through the process. And then, your question kind of gets to the reputation. And I think this plays to predictability and transparency.
Yeah.
And Jason, I think you're seeing a lot of this in the marketplace where procurement tends to flex in terms of their policies, in terms of their procedures, and things like, so operations doesn't know to exactly expect the steps and activities that are involved. When is just a quote good enough? When do we actually need to involve sourcing? When are 3 bids and a buy good versus doing a full RFP? That transparency and expectation makes everybody happier if very clear, hey, this is going to require 3 bids and a buy, or you need to use a preferred supplier in this case. So I think that having that transparent process, knowing what step to expect, and then being able to see the steps and the status really makes it a lot better, where I think that's the perception aspect is you're being proactive to get ahead of the business, and then you're being fast and efficient and predictable and transparent as you think through the reactive stance.
Yeah, I think that's been a big contributing factor in the negative perceptions of procurement is that the process for a long time has just been a complete black box. So, Sean, when you talked about it in terms of predictability and transparency, oftentimes people are navigating in the dark. They don't really understand what the process is, how the individual process steps kind of align, what's next, why am I being asked for the same information over and over again? That creates this air of mystery and really, frankly, a bunch of frustrated people, both on the requester side as well as on the sourcing side, because they're kind of the face of this process and they're bearing the brunt of it. The other comment I would just make just in terms of like changing perceptions, I think perceptions have a really long shelf life. And if people have had a negative experience, it's amazing how long that will linger. I mean, I remember at Discover where I worked prior to Zip, someone would raise this issue that they had and say like, well, when did that happen? We're like, oh, that was 5 years ago. It's like 5 years ago, right? Like so much has changed over the last 5 years. We've dramatically improved this process. And so people have a hard time kind of letting those things go. And that's where the opportunity to maybe over communicate the benefits or the change that you've been able to drive and the benefits that those are brought is really important to say, hey, look, times have changed and we've got a much better user experience now. We have a much better handle on what our process is. And frankly, it's way better than it used to be.
Yeah, I think actions lead to that changing perception, don't they? Because I think all of us have sat around a table trying to sell a stakeholder on this time it's different when you're going through a transformation and had a lot of rolling eyes staring at us, because, we were told that 3 years ago and 4 years ago and 5 years ago, what really is going to be different. And it really is in the actions that you're able to take to, to fulfill the commitments that you're making when you say that this time it's going to be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Kelly, sometimes these perceptions can lead to a bit of an us versus them situation when you put your procurement hat on. And I know, again, earlier in my career, that's probably the way that I was conditioned to think about, well, stakeholders don't want to work with us. That's a them problem rather than an us problem. How do we make sure that we don't get set in that mindset and actually take it for what it is, and as something to be addressed, as opposed to be something that becomes kind of the battle cry for procurement?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and we're lucky, right? Because we're interviewing hundreds of people a year.
Yeah.
And so we get to certainly read interesting reports and articles and things that come out, but also hear how people represent themselves, even with us without us specifically asking, how do you handle this situation? And when I think about this and how procurement can do it today, I actually think this is where we have to separate from just procurement or everybody in procurement to what can the CPO, VP, head of procurement do, and what does the rest of the team need to do?
Mm-hmm.
When I think about some of the really standout CPOs that we've had a chance to talk to recently, I think about CPOs who will say, I want a dedicated comms person. I need to be out there doing this good work. And so I don't need somebody full-time, right? But I need somebody that's available to me so I can go out and speak, so I can do a podcast. Because if we look polished in a podcast, then, hey, our suppliers are going to have an expectation for how prepared they need to be when they come in for meetings with us. Or a CPO who will say, yes, I know 18 years ago, somebody didn't return your phone call, but today I'm here and you need to let me do my job. And my job is this. And what you're doing right now is getting in the way of me being able to fulfill the role that I need to be in. So at the CPO level, I think it's incredibly important that even if it's a little bit of a persona, right? It's not about being pushy or self-promotional, but having a high expectation for how the team will be regarded internally. At other levels within procurement, I think it comes down to old school professionalism. And that's actually a word that I'm going to say in the last 3 or 4 months has been repeatedly popping up in conversations to the point where I'm starting to notice the trend. And I think some of it is probably the world going back to the office, finally getting over, the Zoom universe. But almost charming, antiquated concepts of professionalism become competitive differentiators when nobody else is doing them. And yes, it's things like be on time for meetings, but be prepared, have done your work, have read ahead, have some thoughts to take with you into the meeting. I think something like that, rather than trying to say to the business, hey, I need you to give me my due, communicates indirectly to the business. I am here. I am taking this very seriously for all of our sakes. And so hopefully it sets the stage with this idea that it's a working session. We have really important things to do here. And so I think, when we think about the things that have changed and haven't, I feel like this is a moment where if the CPO can set the expectation and the rest of the team can step up and fill that in terms of the professionalism that they demonstrate, I actually think, Jason, this speaks to something you were talking about, this sort of like black box idea, that procurement is coming to the table with an idea in our minds of how it's going to work. And they're sort of coming to mind with a question mark. How do you think that sort of mystery or black box or sense of not knowing how things are going to work runs against when procurement talks about trying to be more customer centric internally? Those two things to me seem to clash.
Yeah, let's talk about customer centricity. If you look at the current state of how a requester needs to engage with procurement and the procurement process, it's fundamentally flawed. So, for a lot of the companies that Sean and I talk to, these are large enterprises. They're very complex environments. They have many different systems that support that procurement process. There are, frankly, very stringent kind of laws and regulations that need to be met in the course of managing that process. And what we've asked requesters to do largely is understand this process that they're only going to engage in maybe 2 or 3 times a year. We did a study once at Discover 85% of our 1,000 requesters submitted 3 or fewer requests in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do is we ask requesters to understand this really complex process that might have multiple intakes. We ask them to study numerous policies that might be, governing this end-to-end process, look at a bunch of different procedures, and expect them to be able to figure that out and to be able to navigate it. And they really haven't been enabled to be successful in that. And so when they do that wrong, what do? We actually beat them over the head with a club. We give them audit findings. We say, you're on a non-compliance list. Guess what that does from a perception perspective?
Yep.
And are they the first in line in order to engage procurement the next time around? No, because they're probably pissed off from the last time. So this idea of customer centricity is eliminating all of that, right? Let's make it as easy as possible for the requester to engage in this process, eliminate all the institutional knowledge that's required to be able to navigate it, and then very clearly walk them through a process that is tailored to the specifics of their request and that is compliant. And by virtue of doing that, you're going to have happier customers. Maybe you actually have people who want to engage with procurement earlier. And you're eliminating a lot of the problems that we see throughout the process. We have frustrated requesters. They're being asked for the same information over and over again. They're trying to juggle 5 or 6 different system IDs that have been created through the course of that process. It is nuts, right? And it's basically flipping the script from maybe the legacy P2P approach that's been taken in the past, where we had these systems that were really designed for procurement, and flipping that on its head and saying, how do we actually design this for the people who are actually going to be engaging in this process and consuming these services? So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. And it's interesting because as you talk about, certainly as procurement, we see both sides. We see all of the complexity and sophistication and the multiple business objectives, but we also get the feedback or see the response from our stakeholders. And I can hear this tiny little voice in the back of my head, my old procurement practitioner self thinking, if I make procurement look or seem too simple, the business is not going to know how sophisticated we really are. Almost like a point of insecurity. Like if it doesn't sound complicated, then it couldn't possibly be difficult. Is this something that procurement needs to get over? Is this the piece of the stereotype or the negative perception of procurement that we sort of need to resolve within ourselves before we can fix it from a customer centricity or procurement experience perspective out in the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do. I mean, I think it's fine if we hide this complexity from the requesters and the stakeholders that we're working with. A concept that I've heard a lot in speaking with the CPOs of different companies is they want to make procurement invisible, right? They want to make it as seamless and easy as possible for the business and their stakeholders to buy things at their company and buy things at the best value and the lowest price, right? And so, yeah, I'm comfortable hiding that complexity in a way that still delivers results. I think that's totally fine.
Yeah. Sean, if I pull you in on this, I guess, first of all, to what extent do you sort of agree with the general conversation about customer centricity? But I also would love to have you comment on that concept of moving deliberately towards an invisible procurement.
I would say almost all of my conversations lately with at least the chief procurement officers are talking about being more customer centric in certain ways. And to me, that's personalizing and customizing a solution for a department or a project really is how I think about it, because there are different avenues and aspects of that. I'll give you an example where I think it is trying to be invisible is in life sciences, where you've got heavily specialized, costly resources like scientists and researchers, et cetera. They're doing the request, right, for suppliers or at least trying to purchase goods or services. That need of trying to have them do the process should be invisible. And I see a lot of the companies and pharmaceutical companies trying to do this full hand-holding, white glove service where you take a quick intake of what they need and we hand-hold them through the entire process, and they have no idea all the things going on behind the scenes, but we make it extremely easy for them on their behalf and meet their timelines, and they don't know anything behind the scenes. I think that's great. I think it's going through the procurement process. They just don't know it. They don't know that we have catalogs or preferred suppliers. or meeting certain volume thresholds. All they care about is, that was easy, and now my product is getting delivered. I think the flip side is slightly where we're seeing some companies try to centralize, and centralize maybe not the right word, but do more category buying or moving away from decentralized local plant buying. So I'm going more towards the direct side of the house, where the perception is we're trying to be customer centric of giving them more category expertise. But the feeling is, in the complexity where I'm dealing with my clients, is they also feel that, do we know the local market? Do we know the preferences? Do we know the relationships that they have? And still being able to still manage those buys and showcase the value and efficiency that we can bring. I think if you make it easy enough for them, over time, that'll gain the adoption when you're trying to do these more category buying or centralized buying approaches, where we're trying to still have a small feel, but a big procurement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, those CPOs that you talked about that are sort of emphasizing becoming more customer centric, are you seeing them go through a formal process where it's, how does everybody feel about us today? What are the pain points? Is it, how formal of an improvement program is it versus, hey, you guys, try to be friendlier in meetings. We want people to have a better sort of experience. How deliberate and purposeful and even quantitative are some of the different procurement teams being about this?
I would say vary at the moment, from, doing surveys to maturity models. I would say most are starting with just the maturity of their organization and then building their strategy from there.
Okay.
And then taking that strategy with the end state in mind and communicating that out. Here's our goals, here's our metrics we want to achieve. Then they can start to identify, here's the people, process, the policies, and the tech that we need to do it, and telling out to the organization, here's our full strategy. And that makes sense to everybody, that they can see, hey, here's the roadmap and the vision that we want to get to, and here's how it's going to help you and influence you. So I think you mentioned the a comms person for the CPO. I love that. I think you need to be out there.
I thought that was a
telling
cool
success
idea.
stories and telling them, here's our vision, here's how we're tracking to it, here's what's coming next for you, and here's why it's important to you, right? Get to the why. I think that is awesome, of a way to go, where a lot of our clients are being very clear in their direction and their communication to their stakeholders. And ultimately, that's the hope, is to get better buy-in, hopefully achieve more together, right?
But then, and feel free to correct me if this isn't entirely what you meant, because I think I'm sort of connecting pieces here. It almost sounds like the organizations and the procurement teams that are already more mature and sophisticated are doing a better job of improving the procurement experience, whereas it's maybe organizations that are middle of the road, right, where there's been an issue in the past, or the team is newer, or the team is smaller, or the company as a whole isn't quite as mature and sophisticated. Is it harder in those cases where, ironically, the opportunity is greater, but the hill is steeper? Do you see what I'm saying? Is there a connection between sort of the customer centricity and overall company maturity?
I think maturity does matter here. I really do. I think, and I'm defining maturity as you've got the standardized processes, the right technology, and the right people, right? Those organizations are focusing on timing. I see it as just they're focusing on building time for their organization. I think that's where it becomes more crucial, beneficial, that they're able to make decisions because they had more time to get the right data. Their teams and solutions are storing that data so they have the right visibility. That way they can start to do the research, build the strategic relationships. In your old school, I'm looking at the chat, was like old school professionalism of, you came prepared, right? With here's the market leaders for this product. Here's how much we've spent. Here's our, demand for the upcoming year. All of those things, you need time. And I think when you're at the more mature organization, they have those data points at their hand to spend more time coming prepared, giving more visibility, and doing the right effort. Yeah. That's what I love and see at the maturing organizations versus the ones that are still trying to say, hey, we don't have a great technology, or we don't have the right data. They're not able to bring all that together yet, where they're still trying to compile their vision. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, I do think there's an aspect of the more mature organizations can focus on that.
Can I just jump in with like a follow-up
course.
on that? So it's more a comment as opposed to a question, but it's really interesting. Like you both talked about invisible procurement, and I'm a really big believer of that's direction of travel for procurement organizations. And when you think about the procurement operating model, we kind of start decentralized, and then there is a push to go to centralized. And then there's a realization that centralized was good in terms of it moved an organization in a certain way, but it created as many problems as it solved. So then we got to center-led, which is starting to devolve some things back into the business. And we're at this point now where there's the opportunity to go further, and whether it's a business-centric model, but has a lot more decentralization, but with that invisible touch, is kind of where I'm interested in seeing how the procurement operating model goes. But kind of to the point of, do you have to be a certain level of maturity? It's right now, I don't necessarily see that you have to go through the pain of decentralized to centralized before it kind of opens the mind to what's a different approach. And what will be interesting to me, and I'd love both of your opinions if you think that this is a path that we're on, is like, how do you skip the generations of change where you go straight from a decentralized straight to you still decentralized, but it's more invisible? Or do you have to go through the arc, if you will, of the different operating models before you get there?
I'll give you an analogy. I think you do have to go through some of the pain of getting the standardization of the process. And it's a sports analogy, so I apologize, but coaching baseball, you teach everybody the exact same swing.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody shouldn't have the same swing if you really think about it. But the idea is that I can quickly look at a kid that's swinging and notice his elbow is falling or he's moving the wrong way. The idea behind that, teaching everybody the same thing or the standardized process, is that I can quickly identify a deviation. That's what companies are looking for, is this. They're not following the right process. We're not doing the right thing here. We're not getting enough time for actually doing an event. We're skipping the PO process. We're not setting up the PO correctly. That's where the standardized process helps you identify those deviations. Once you fix those, then you can start to your way, go to more of a hybrid model of a decentralized or centralized or business-led. But you have to build that standardization so you could start to identify where in the business are we not following it and find deviations, if that makes sense. That's at least how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's kind of a foundation that you need to build, and then you might have, to your point, Sean, deviations above that, right? I don't think there's just a standard operating model that every company should adopt, because there are some nuances in each individual company. If that was the case, I mean, Sean would just essentially go to every single company and implement the same thing. You wouldn't even need to do any discovery or figure out what's happening there, right? But that's just not the reality of it.
Do you think that used to be our reality, and that's what drove some of the perception issue? Because historically we did try more often than not to push a one-size-fits-all procurement model on organizations, and you would hear so many times, well, I'm different, and our response to that was, you're not as different as you think you are. Well, maybe you are, and now we're realizing that, and having the ability to build processes that reflect that uniqueness, rather than just trying to shove in the same 6-step process, for example, for everything.
Yeah,
I think we've seen that a lot from a technology perspective. I think if you look at what I would call kind of legacy source to pay systems, there's always been this idea that we shouldn't have to do any customization or configuration. We should just be able to implement it out of the box, right? And I think as a function, we have been really hard on ourselves when those implementations haven't gone well. And we have blamed ourselves, frankly, that like, oh, we did a bad job of implementing it, or we over-configured it, et cetera. I think the reality is each organization has its own complexities that need to be accounted for. And while there is core functionality there, I think when you started to expand from that and maybe deviate, it created some issues and it couldn't be adopted at your organization. So what I'm actually excited about from a technology perspective is we have tools now, and like, look, I work at Zip, right? I'll say Zip, that provide flexibility to be able to handle the specific nuances of your organization and your process, right? In a way that's still going to be very user-centric, is going to drive a compliant process, but that's not going to break, right? It needs to be flexible to account for your specific environment and the technology that you have within it. So I'm actually excited from a technology perspective. We're getting out of this idea that it's just like, hey, implement this big thing. And, like, I think hopefully over time that'll go kind of, to the side. We might tweak those things on the edges, but I think the individual point solutions and the orchestration layers that are out there are going to be really driving a materially better process for your end users and creating a much better experience.
Jason, to what extent can that new approach to technology actually start to shift the relationship building model between procurement and the rest of the business, right? So do you think in their minds they connect, oh, it's easier now to get my whatever, to know where my approval is? Are they able to connect that with, oh, this experience brought to you by a wonderful, mature procurement team? Or do we need to be out there in the organization specifically messaging that?
I think it's going to do a couple of things. And we already see this with some clients, right? Which is this idea from moving from tactical to strategic. How do you actually make that shift? Part of it is unloading a lot of that tactical work that you were doing, right? You need to free up some capacity to be able to move up that curve. And what we see, like, Sean brought up an example of a model that a lot of people are doing in the absence of an enabling technology in this area, which is we're staffing resources to effectively do white glove service and hold people's hands through the process, right? Well, if you eliminate that mystery in the black box that surrounds this process and you provide transparency into what the process is and the status and who's working on it, do you need to do as much of that anymore? Or can you take the time and the resources that were dedicated to that and move up that maturity curve so that you are having those more strategic conversations? I think part of it is just a function of pure capacity. And if we solve for that, then, like Kelly, one of the things you brought up is just like pure professionalism. This is where I think just having an amazing set of soft skills and understanding, what's important for your stakeholders from a business perspective and how procurement and sourcing can support that is going to be invaluable. Because I do see the tactical layer we will continue to very quickly chip away at so that those activities are no longer, right? Am I going to say they're 100% going to go away? Probably not. Yeah. But I do think there will be a material reduction in those transactional activities.
Yeah, if I could jump in there real quick, Kelly, I think it also goes to what we should be doing as a procurement organization of negotiating contracts that are strong and can be found and visible, having preferred supplier lists and rate cards with materials that we can find. That works so well with the technology. It's when you haven't done that work and they're doing a request for the first time and they're like, I just need this. I don't know what to find. Where I think if you're focusing on being proactive and setting all that up behind the scenes, the technology can flow straight through and really, to Jason's point, start to eliminate more of those high touch needs that we have in certain organizations.
Yeah. And Phil, this comes back to something you actually mentioned before, but that I actually want to deliberately pause and think about, is the idea of procurement operating models.
Yeah.
Right. So we talk about that all the time. And you kind of talked about the shift from decentralized, right, to centralized, to center-led. But we're having a lot of conversations right now about figuring out exactly, okay, what is procurement's operating model for this organization? And what does that mean we're supposed to change? How does that mean we're going to segment the work? And whether it's around skills, whether it's about capacity. I also love the point Sean made earlier about sort of creating time and how you use that time strategically. How in all of this do we really need to stop and look inward at that operating model and figure out what we need to change, both so that procurement works better, but also in a way that the rest of the organization can actually experience?
Well, I think it's interesting that, the conversations we have on procurement operating model, the leaders, we talked earlier about leadership and, what do we see in a lot of the leaders that we talk to. Actually, when it comes to operating model, we hear from a lot of leaders like, I don't know the answer, but I'm kind of on this journey of discovery, and that new technologies are enabling me to be on this journey of discovery. And I actually love the conversations with CPOs who are open to the fact that, look, I don't necessarily have a fixed goal in 3 years' time, but I know that doing more with less, there's just a pressure. That's the current models they're at breaking point, because you continue to see in all the data about procurement having to do more work, and budgets that do exist are not going to people, they are going to technology as well. So technology is kind of the one of the ways to solve for that problem. But we're at a breaking point. But there isn't necessarily a, this is how I'm going to take this. And I actually really enjoy those conversations, because that's where a lot of the creativity around, how can we redefine what procurement can do is. I think that, the experience is, as I think Jason said, 85% of people who at Discover who are interacting with procurement only do 1, 2, or 3 interactions per year. That drives a lot of the perception. I've always said around, the way to change perception is to make it easier to buy a pen. But that's what we don't focus on. We go in and focus on some of the bigger things first, and we forget about that. But it's the conversations in the car with the CFO and the CEO going to a meeting or driving to a conference, and the CFO is complaining that one of their people, had to go through 10 steps and hoops to buy something easy. That's where perception is formed, and then it drives back down in the organization. So focusing on things like that is, where I see a lot of the opportunity. And something else I just wanted to tap into was, and it's something that Tony mentioned in the comments about building freedom within frameworks, which I love the idea of. We're in this world of hyper personalization, and that's really what we're expecting the process to be able to do, is know who I am, what it is that, what I'm buying, where I'm located, and know all those things, and provide an experience that feels like it's an experience that's built for me, rather than pushing me through, a single process, which goes back to that one size fits all. So that's what I'm really excited about. And as I say, I know that that Zip is supporting this event, but orchestration for me is just a really big opportunity for us to rethink how we're kind of enabling all those workflows.
Yeah, and Phil, it's funny, the example you provided, those would be the ones that would create the most noise. It's like, why do I have to have 3 approvals to buy a pack of AA batteries? Yeah. Or like, I'm just trying to reserve a room at a restaurant for dinner, right? Like, why is this so difficult? That's what creates the most noise.
I had to go to Staples to buy it because my system wouldn't let me buy it myself. Those kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a problem, a bit of information asymmetry, right? Because you have a challenge where somebody has this very simple thing that they want to get done. And unfortunately, we end up oftentimes kind of putting them through this kind of one size fits all approach, right? Mm-hmm. The process needs to be tailored to the specifics of what it is you're buying. And I do think that will start to change perceptions and create a much better end user experience too.
Yeah. A quick follow-up, and Sean, we talk about kind of the end goal therefore of creating an environment and experience for stakeholders where it does feel as though it's hyper-targeted and personalized. Where do you start? That feels like a long way away from the experience that most are able to provide to their stakeholders today.
Yeah. I'm supposed to probably say surveys for all the human resources and change management folks out there. I think we know and see that, you're only getting 20%, 30% of responses in those, and you're tailoring specific responses to what you want to get. I love interviews. That's what we do. We help. And my recommendation is set goals for your category managers and your senior leaders to do 5 a period, right? Go out there and talk to your end users and get the feedback, because you're able to deep dive into certain, oh, really? Why did you have an issue with a pencil? And you were also trying to buy a professional services contract for millions of dollars and you have no issues, but the pencil's frustrating you. But you can't get into that nuance unless you're talking to your stakeholders. And I think it's also a great opportunity for you to set the vision and direction with them to say, hey, look, we're doing this interview. We're really trying to set the stage for the next 3 years of how we build personas and the buying experience. We want to hear from you. And they're like, oh, really? Okay. And here's what we're trying to do with procurement. So you're able to influence them at the same time they feel important and are giving you the right feedback. So I think to hear your perception is extremely important. 1, Phil. 2 is the best way to do is hear from them, right? Like, ask the questions. Where are you frustrated? What makes it difficult? What do you like? All of those are, to me, it's a 30-minute meeting. It can be a 15-minute meeting. But setting goals for your category managers and senior leaders to go back out, and then you bring those teams together and say, hey, what are we hearing? What are the trends? What are the insights? So everybody around the room hears it. I think this is just an awesome experience for all procurement organizations to have. It's an hour-long conversation, maybe 90 minutes, and everybody walks out of there going, man, that was really a cool experience. And now we can now set the strategic direction, slightly change it up or down depending on what we're hearing, or we need to go back and communicate. It's going to be difficult because that's what we're trying to do right now. But at least you can change the message to hit the right tones or what we're hearing from the audience.
Jason, I'm going to come and ask you the same question in a moment, but I want to just follow up, Sean, on you gathering that information. How do you capture it? And how do you, I think about from a sales and a marketing perspective, you may build journey maps of your prospects. And I know that journey mapping is something we've talked a lot about on the podcast, but a long time ago. Do you go to kind of the detail of, okay, we've heard this about the experience. Now we truly need to map out that experience to understand what it is, or, just what are some of the ways to capture that so you can act on it?
Yeah, journey maps is awesome. It's a little more detailed than what I've done just in the timing aspect of it. I think that's the more mature way to go about it. I like just informal afterwards. Yeah. So what we've done at least is you spend 30 minutes in the interview, and then you have 30 minutes blocked to take the notes and themes down. And then what we did was we had the category managers then present their findings for their 5. And that gave them time to present and think through the key themes and insights from that standpoint. So it's a little more informal, Phil, at least in my experience of how we've recommended it.
There's a feedback loop.
There's definitely has to be a feedback loop. Besides using somebody to, take notes and kind of have specific questions and responses, then it becomes a little more, we didn't get through question 7. In my experience, that's why I think your journey maps, we're doing a little more informal and having people just give them the structure of here's the cadence, here were the top 5 things we saw, what we wanted to work on, and what we're doing well. And don't forget the doing well, right? Like I love that. If you guys ever read the book Strength Finder, I think it's 2.0, like focus on the things you're doing well. Don't just focus on the things that you need to improve. I love doubling down on where you're doing really well and selling those success stories and doing what you're doing there.
That's often a confidence thing as well, isn't it? You're not necessarily sure because you hear all the negatives. You're not really sure where you are doing well, and don't necessarily have the confidence to lean into that sometimes. So I know we're always coached. As business owners, you got to celebrate your successes, and it's easier said than done for sure.
Yeah, agreed.
Jason, any from your personal experience, anything to add to what Sean talked about in terms of gathering that feedback and collecting it and then being in a position to start acting on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think feedback's very important. In most cases, you're getting unsolicited feedback, which is great too. In terms of your original question about where to start, what I would recommend is, and where I see a gap in a lot of companies I talk to, there's no global process owner over your entire source to pay process. That's a really good one. And so nobody's accountable for driving improvements in it. And what I've seen, and oftentimes, is procurement and sourcing just wants to focus on their part of that process. Well, unfortunately, your requesters and your business stakeholders, they're looking at that full end-to-end process, and they're looking at you. So for better or worse, those negative perceptions are going to continue to linger until you actually look at the full end-to-end process and try to fix it effectively, right? So lean into that and find ways to partner with the cross-functional teams who are involved in that process to take a look at it end to end and see where there are opportunities to really drive efficiency, tailor your workflows based on what it is people are buying. Like that's what I would start with, is kind of a simple organizational thing, but have somebody accountable for it and then give that person some executive level support so they can be successful when they start engaging these cross-functional groups.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sorry, Sean, I spoke over you.
No, I totally agree. I think that's an expectation I had with more mature organizations. I was exactly at what Jason had there.
We're going to wrap up in a moment. I just do want to bring up, there was a question that Alison asked when we were talking about interviews. Alison said that it's not always practical to do interviews for, and it's hard to measure sometimes kind of the output of that. We talked a little bit about how we capture that information. Are there analytic tools that you've used to try and quantify or even plot the responses, on a maturity chart, or any ways you can kind of take that information and make it a little bit more analytical or data based?
I haven't necessarily, besides the obvious Excel and doing some surveys that are associated to it. For me, it was more, how do we know the perception of the procurement organization, and hearing from the ground up of just getting that to help build our strategy and vision, as opposed to doing a actual measurement or metric of what's the voice of the customer and satisfaction scores, those kind of things, where I think that this question is probably going to more where, how do you actually measure that you're getting better? I think you can always get better, faster, stronger in procurement. So to me, I just want to keep hearing the insights and start to make sure that we're influencing our strategy based on our end users.
I have one follow-up, but just in the nature of when you're doing your interviews, do you find that there is any openness to recording those interviews, or is it not really something that you've broached, or that you would fear that they wouldn't be so honest? And the reason I asked that is because Tony popped in the comments that this is where AI could be helpful and could analyze the responses, identify themes, trends, etc., provide recommendations for which you need a transcript, which goes to the openness to record, so you can gather transcripts to then have analysis done into the key themes through AI.
We usually don't make them anonymous, but I haven't done that yet of recording them, just from a discussion of which ones I've been in from certain assessments. But whoever came up with that, I think it's perfect, right? It's a great use of AI.
I think the key thing here too is everybody loves to survey, right? I like surveying too. I like to get CSAT surveys, right? Yeah. But I think you have to take it a step further and actually engage and have a discussion with your stakeholders. Because I think oftentimes we kind of like hide behind surveys, and we feel like we're really making improvements based on that. You got to get out and talk to people. I mean, Kelly, it's kind of the professionalism that you were talking about. Like, just talk to your stakeholders, right? You're going to have to develop these relationships anyway to be successful in your role. This is a great opportunity to do that.
And don't forget to listen to what they say after you talk to them.
Right.
True. Yeah.
I mean, there's so much nuance that you can't pick up in surveys. I mean, we utilize them. We utilize NPS scores and get interesting feedback that we gather from that. But there's lots of nuances that you'll only get from speaking to somebody. That's not going to show itself in the data. And that's probably the insights that you want to hear, or that you need to hear.
Yeah.
All right. I know it's coming up on time, so we're going to wrap up now. First of all, before we do, I just want to remind everybody that there is a white paper, Procurement at the Crossroads, that accompanies today's discussion, that's been produced and published by Harvard Business Review in partnership with Deloitte and with Zip. So please feel free to download that. You can do it there in the chat window. I want to thank everybody for joining us and for a really interesting discussion. It's a really exciting time. That's sometimes cliche in procurement, I think, over the last few years. But now we're coming to this point where there's truly this direction of travel that we're being enabled by lots of new technology and lots of new ways of thinking that there isn't necessarily the answer to of what's right for everybody, and we're all on this journey. So Jason and Sean, I want to thank you so much for sharing, for you joining us and for sharing some of your perspectives and experiences. And of course, if anybody would like to reach out to you directly afterwards, I'm sure they'll find you on LinkedIn to be able to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having us. Great discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, again, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will be back soon with another AOP Live. All right. Take care, everybody.